get started. So I read you moved to East Tennessee from Northern California following graduating from UC Davis. And what was the cause of that move?
Well, I got the job here at the Tennessee Clean Water Network. They were looking for an executive director, and I applied and was given the job, so I moved here.
Gotcha. And you grew up in Northern California, which is obviously a very pretty area, a lot of trees and mountains there, similar to here. Did your interests with environmentalism like start young, or was it more of in like college, or when did you kind of like become interested in that?
You know, I was always interested in it. My grandfather taught me how to ride a horse when I was 5, so I spent a lot of time outside with him riding, and I spent time in the 4-H club. So I spent a lot of time outdoors.
Gotcha. And okay, and sorry. So, how did moving to Tennessee then influence your current environmentalist political ideas?
Well, from moving from California to Tennessee, you know, there's a lot more environmental regulation and enforcement in California. So when I moved here, I was surprised to see that there was very little enforcement of environmental regulations. So the Tennessee Clean Water Network really became something of an enforcement arm for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. So we did a series of enforcement reports where we outlined how the state really wasn't enforcing environmental regulations, because there was a rumor at the state legislature that TDEC was over-enforcing the law and driving industry and business from the state. So we started looking into it and discovered that actually that wasn't the case. And in fact, all the years that we monitored enforcement in Tennessee, it went from a high of 204 enforcement actions in a year to 15 in 2015. And the state manages over 25,000 permits. So we could prove then that the state wasn't really driving industry. Industry, if it was leaving for another reason.
Okay. And you're kind of presented with an interesting challenge. And a couple years ago, there was a major forest fire in the Appalachians. A lot of it affected near the Gatlinburg area. What are your sort of plans to deal with that in the post-relief effort and managing that situation currently?
So at the federal level, what we would probably be looking at is providing more funding for these kinds of relief efforts. I believe the city of Gatlinburg did ask for some FEMA funds, and it would be my job to protect those funds. I think we're going to see more big catastrophic fires and floods as the planet continues to warm up. And there's going to be some real challenges facing that. It's going to be harder for people to get insurance because, especially if they're living in the mountains or near a floodplain or near the coast. The current floodplain insurance that is run through the federal government, the floodplain insurance, is now going broke, because what they do is they encourage you to rebuild back where you were. And if they're encouraging you to rebuild in the floodplain, well, then you're just going to get flooded out again. So we're hoping to redo that program so that you could get the money to rebuild, but then it would be taken out of the floodplain.
Right. And so, finally, you are a Democrat, obviously, and Tennessee is historically mostly a Republican state. What sort of challenges does that bring to the table, and how does that kind of affect your campaign?
Well, actually, when I got here, the delegation was mostly Democrat. There were a couple of Republicans. First, second, and third, I think, districts were Republicans, and the rest were all Democrats. So when I used to lobby at the federal level, I used to lobby the Congress people, they were very favorable to what we were asking. Although I used to say that the environment is nonpartisan, nobody wanted really to deal with it. So it was once Democrat, and I think this district has been Republican, though, for a long time, 157 years. So that's going to be a very big challenge. But we think this district has changed, unlike the other districts. We have Knoxville and Marable, whose demographics have really changed. And that's evidenced by the attendance at the Women's March, both the first year and the second year. We had 14,000 people here for the second year. 15,000 people showed up in Nashville, and 11,000 showed up in Memphis, and those are much bigger cities. The Pride Parade had 23,000 people show up for that. So there's just a lot more interest in these issues, and I think it's not quite as red as we think it is. We also had the lowest voter turnout in the country, so we really don't know how red this area is.
Let's switch out interviewers. I'm going to ask this young woman hiding behind the post.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right.
This is like rapid fire policy.
It is.
Hi, I'm Jessie.
Hi, Jesse. Nice to meet you.
So you talked about your time in environmental issues. What other aspects of your background do you think qualify you for this position?
Well, before I was doing environmental work, I worked for the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, and I worked on immigration issues. Back in the Reagan administration, when Republicans really felt that a path to citizenship was what was needed. And we need to go back to that. We don't have a clear path to citizenship. We don't have a clear workers program here. And so we need to fix these problems in immigration, because what we've just done with immigration is militarized the border and then created a situation where we're encouraging the illegal crossing of undocumented people. So that's been very helpful.
Yeah. What kind of legislation would you like to see on immigration?
Well, I would like to see DACA expanded. You know, right now it's for a very limited amount of people, but if we could expand that to all of those that can comply with the requirements. And I would also like to see a more defined pathway to citizenship, so that you know it costs this much, it takes this long, and that's the line you stand in. And then for workers, our worker visa program is a kind of a lottery, and it's a little bit based on countries, and there's a lot of what's the word? It's not a lottery. It's a quota systems for other countries. So and some of that, stiffer quotas for countries that are low income and folks that are people of color, and so we need to change those quotas so that we get the workforce that we want, and we don't have to worry about necessarily having a lot of undocumented people up here.
Yeah. So there's a lot of discourse going on in Congress right now. How would you like to change sort of the environment and how we have debates across the aisle?
Well, I like to remind folks that Howard Baker Jr., who is from this area, was very good at discourse and was very civil. And when he was Speaker of the House, people remarked at how fair he was. And I think you notice that first in the campaigns. The campaigns need to be civil. They need to point out, I think, the deficiencies and weaknesses in the other candidate without making it personal and making it ugly. And I think the good news about the last election is that everybody that got really ugly lost. And I think the electorate is now tired of that kind of behavior. So I think we're seeing a change in what the public wants to support now, and that's going to be really helpful in the future.
Perfect. How do you want to work with the president to because you disagree with him on a lot of issues, how do you want to work with him to do what's best for Tennessee?
Well, if he supports something that's good for Tennessee, of course, I'll support it. I'm concerned about the tariffs. I'm concerned about, what he's doing to agriculture. I'm concerned about the farm bill. If he can meet us, halfway or three-quarters, I'd be happy. But we'll see. We'll see if he's willing to do that.
Perfect.
Let's swap out interviewers. Carrie. Says Carrie.
Oh.
I forgot to print out my questions, so let's just...
You can do it. You're tough.
I plan to run for president in 2036.
Excellent.
With that. To begin with, so a lot of your background in environmental protection, you focused a lot on cleaning the water. Is there anything else you'd like to investigate and look into if you were to get into office?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we're going to face is climate change. And so we need to move to renewable and clean energy. And that's one thing I really do want to focus on, encouraging TVA to provide more renewable and clean energy options.
That would be pretty awesome. So like a specific focus, you think in solar or like wind energy?
Solar, wind, I think all of those things are things we need to look at now, because we've waited too long to solve this problem of climate change, and we need to get on it.
I would agree with that. If you were to get into office, how would you celebrate? In Disney World?
I'd probably take a long nap. It's pretty exhausting. I don't know what I do. Apparently I don't get any rest. Once you get elected, then you have to go create an office in DC, and you have to create the office here, and then you've got satellite offices throughout the district. And then I found out that you go to Congress school. You go to the Harvard Business School for a week, and they teach you about what your role is and how the system works, and then you have to set up your office, and you have to find staff.
Wow.
So it's not like I get to stop in November and then start up again, and go get sworn in. There's just
a lot of pre-gaming to becoming a congressional district representative, I suppose. What are you doing to get voters excited to get out and poll and like get to the polling booths? I know that that's been a problem. Like, you know, recently the last election was just we had a lot of problems with turnouts for especially the Democratic Party.
Mhm.
Is there anything?
Yeah, we saw a real increase in Democratic turnout. I think Republican turnout stayed about the same, and Democratic turnout came, it was jumped by at least a couple 100%. So that's good, and we're hoping that new people will come out. We're working on lists that we have. We're canvassing and phone banking as much as possible. So if anybody would like to volunteer, Drew Dyson, who is the UT Young Dems president, is back there, and he can get you set up with the party if you guys would like to help. Not only me, but we've got a lot of other candidates. I think another thing that's going to spur voter interest is that we have so many good candidates running. It used to be that you would go to a presidential election because the Democrats only really offered you a president and maybe a senator or a congressperson. And now we've got good down ballot candidates running. Gloria Johnson, Jamie Ballinger, Eddie Nelson, Colleen Martinez, Justin Davis, Greg McKay. I mean, there's just, no matter where you are in this district, you're going to have good representation and a good person to vote for.
It's a very exciting year for Tennessee with Haslam and Duncan on the way out. It's been, like half a century since we haven't had a Duncan in this district.
That's right.
So it's very exciting regardless of who gets it. Let's see, what else is on the map?
I think I'll switch interviewers now, Carrie.
Thank you, man.
You're welcome.
It's nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah.
While we're getting another interviewer up here, I'll just take the instructor liberty.
Okay.
You may have seen that story by Jamie Satterfield about the horrific coal ash injuries that are happening.
Oh, yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, should that be a high priority for the next congressperson to make sure these workers get some sort of compensation for being exposed?
Oh, yeah,
To
I
radium
imagine
and
there may be some congressional hearings that will be associated with that. You know, when I worked that, I was,
Come on up.
actually I worked that disaster when I was at the Tennessee Clean Water Network, and I remember standing out on that big coal ash pile and seeing like miles of mounds of coal ash and having TVA say, this is absolutely safe, you don't have to worry about it, you know, you can breathe it, you can, play with it, it's just like mulch. Well, it wasn't like mulch, and a lot of people...
Radium, cadmium, arsenic.
Yeah, it's the periodic table of the elements, man, right there.
Yeah.
So,
And it previously had been classified under the Obama administration as toxic waste, and now it's not, as I understand it.
well, the rules are being rolled back.
They're being rolled back.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Sorry to interrupt, but take it over.
Hi, I'm Edwin
Hi.
Keeble. Good to meet you.
Your name again?
Edwin Keeble.
Edwin, nice to meet you.
So your motto for your campaign says Congress doesn't work, let's change that. What are the biggest problems in Congress today, and how can you work towards finding a solution?
Well, I think the first thing is that we've got a lot of folks that have been there for many, 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 many years. Of course, Jimmy Duncan has been there for 33, and his dad was there for 25. And really, Congress, I don't think, is a career. It was never designed to be that way. That's why it's a 2-year term. And so it's important that people cycle in. You know, people have asked me a lot about term limits, and while I think that's part of the solution, I'm thinking 12, 14, maybe 16 at the most, because you need time to get legislation passed. But staying there for 30, 50 years, I just don't think. I think you get entrenched and not in a good way. So we've had a lot of problems in this country that haven't really been solved because one party would be in power and then be mean to the other party, and then they would get in power and retaliate, and that's what we've been having back and forth. So Howard Baker Jr., I was just reading an article about him this weekend, did mention that it was the development of the jet engine that has killed Congress, because it used to be that you would go to Congress and you'd bring your family, and everybody went to school with everybody else's kids, and you saw each other in the evening, or you went to a play that your kid was in, and it's hard to demonize people you know. And now people leave when they gavel out on Wednesday, and they come back for gaveling in on Monday. And they don't spend any time together, so it's easy to just demonize each other. So a lot of, I think what goes on in Congress is just that they don't know each other, and they're jet-lagged.
What are some of the biggest problems that the people of rural Tennessee face?
Well, certainly healthcare was the one I heard. We have the highest hospital closures in the country per capita. And when a hospital closes in a rural community, that's not only healthcare that they lose, it's also a job opportunity. So keeping the rural hospitals open is really going to be something the state legislators are going to have to deal with. And like I said, I talked earlier about all those down ballot candidates, and they're all running on expanding Medicaid, which would have kept those hospitals open. My job would be to make sure that money stays available for them to have. The second thing is they need broadband out there. And Governor Bredesen has introduced a plan to use TVA to get broadband into the rural areas, which I think is a great idea. But I think we really need to concentrate on that because people out there are just using their phones, and it's hard to apply for a job or do your homework on your phone. Or using your hotspot, use up your minutes, it's very expensive. So broadband is something that's very big. The rural areas also have food issues. I think the food system out there is a bit more broken. It's 30 miles to a grocery store, but 5 miles to Pilot. And so a lot of folks are buying their groceries at Pilot, and there's really nothing healthy there to eat. So we do need to work on the food system.
How can Tennessee do a better job to promote renewable energy, and what could renewable energy mean for jobs in the state?
I think renewable energy could mean a lot for jobs in the state. There's a factory called Valker in Bradley County, and it's a big factory. They make solar panels, and that employs a number of people in the surrounding counties. You can put those factories anywhere. They don't have to be necessarily next to a big city, and this one certainly isn't. I think if we had more subsidies for renewable and clean energy, that we could have more opportunity to have more factories that are working on the technology. And that technology development is actually going to spur growth in other areas. So it's not just for the solar power. We're going to find other things. And one thing we really do need to support is Oak Ridge, because Oak Ridge is doing battery technology, and we need battery storage. We need to solve that problem, because until that problem is solved, it just makes it a little bit more difficult. But TVA also needs to come to the table and allow us to have more renewable options. Other utilities do it. There's no reason why they can't.
Okay, we're going to swap out interviews.
Throughout your campaign, you've kind of made a point to not accept super PAC money.
Yeah.
Can you tell me why you've kind of gone about it that way?
Yeah, we're not taking any PAC money. So it's not just corporate PACs. I didn't take money from the unions or the Teachers Association, and that is because I think that corporations and organizations tend to give you money and then they have power over you. So what I said is, I'm just not going to have PAC money. I didn't have it for the primary, and when the general came along, it just seemed just as easy to say no. And frankly, it was a relief for me. It was one of the things that, when I was thinking about running, that troubled me the most was, am I going to have to take PAC money? And people always said, oh yes, you have to take PAC money. Well, no, that's not true. You don't have to. So that was one reason why. Another thing that we're doing is we're trying to be as transparent as possible, and we're going to be putting the names of every donor on our website or on our FEC filings, and that's so that people know who's given to the campaign and know how much, and you can gauge influence by that.
Okay. So last June, both Republicans and Democrats voted on Simple Resolution 176. That was to affirm Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
Mm-hmm.
And even Bernie Sanders voted on it. And then since then, we've seen kind of the systematic oppression of Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
And even Bernie Sanders has backtracked on that. Why do you think no Democrats in Congress voted no on that? And how would you have approached that situation to kind of de-escalate it?
I couldn't answer for their votes, and I don't necessarily want to speak for them. I would not have voted for that. I felt that was really throwing, some fuel onto a situation that was about to blow up. And there was really no reason to move the embassy. I thought it was fine where it was. So I would have voted no on that.
Okay. And right now, prisoners across the country are on strike for what they describe as conditions almost similar to slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And September 9th will be almost 50 years since the Attica uprising,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of symbolizes that things haven't gotten much better in the prison system. How would you go about initiating prison reforms?
I would like to roll back the minimum penalties. They're 10 years for a drug offense, for nonviolent offenders. I'd like to have marijuana taken off the Schedule 1 list so that we could study it and take it and not have it decriminalized for an ounce or less. Our jails are full of folks that have been caught with an ounce or less of marijuana, and it ruins their life. Furthermore, if you think of it, $10,000 a year and the minimum sentence is 10 years. It's $30,000 a year for 10 years, so that's $300,000 we're spending to keep somebody in jail. We're taking their prime years away from them. We're probably making them become a criminal. They're being trained in prison. So we need to have a lot of prison reform, and I'm also against the privatization of prisons. So I would want to take that back under federal and local control.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
All right, well, I guess I'm swapping out interviewers. Do you mind interviewing now? Very good.
Hi, Fatima.
Hi, Fatima.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
All
Tina
right.
came off her deathbed to be here today.
Oh my
She was
goodness.
sick.
Oh my.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about mostly education because that's what I'm really into. So as of right now, Tennessee's high school graduation rate is 89.1%. It is high but not high enough. So what will you do for Tennessee's second district to increase high school graduates?
That's a great question. A lot of decisions on education are really made at the local level. And so funding choices and pay and all that is usually done at the state level and then trickles down to the boards. So my job at the federal level is to make sure that public money stays in public schools, because there is a movement in the Department of Ed through the Secretary of Education to move money from public school to charter schools and voucher programs. And I think once that happens, we're going to see a real decline in graduation rates. So my goal is to protect the Title I funding, to make sure it stays in public schools, and to protect Title IX so that we don't roll back protections to students, especially in special ed.
Another question, what can be done to decrease the high interest rates on student loans?
Well, we could bring them back under the government and have the government just say it's 2.5. It was 2.5% when I graduated, and you could refinance. And so now you can't do any of that, and they become privatized. And like I've said before, this is what happens when things get privatized. So I would want to make sure that the government lowers those interest rates and puts them back to where they were, so that you can afford to have an education.
Okay, perfect. And I have one last question. Do you believe that the U.S. should accept refugees from Syria?
Yes, I do. Yes, on the system that they have developed.
Our last question, why do you think, your answer was about the refugees, our system was, you think they should be able to come because of their system, or can you go into that a little bit more?
We have a system for bringing in refugees from other countries.
Right.
And so we need to allow refugees to come. We need to follow the procedures.
Stick to it.
Yeah.
Okay, and so going off of that, how did you go from immigration to more of a environmental approach to? You said you focused more on immigration.
I did,
No.
yeah. So I was doing some asylum interviews.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I was helping with asylum interviews and on the border at Mexicali.
Okay.
At the detention center. And it was really a powerful experience to do that. And it really does tax your soul to see what goes on in these communities. And I was planning to go to law school, and I was going to work in the immigration. And then I just, through a bunch of circumstances, wasn't able to get into law school, and so I switched gears and went into, just did some science for a couple of years, and then I ended up sort of on that path.
Okay.
And then I followed that path.
Okay. So, what else do I want to ask? It said that your first policy would be to move a House version of the Alexander Murray bill
Yeah.
to help stabilize individual markets. And I was just wondering if you could explain that bill,
Sure,
what that
sure.
includes.
So I was a founding member of the Community Health Alliance, which was Tennessee's first and only cooperative health insurance. So I understand, I got to see how health insurance
Right.
and how the Affordable Care Act came up and then almost went under. And what happened was, when insurance companies are figuring out who they're going to pay for, they create a pool of money that's set aside for the more high-powered, the more high expensive claims. And usually insurance companies can draw from that pool for folks that were really, really sick. But the feds did not release that money, and so all of the insurance companies that were cooperative basically went under a couple of years after they had formed. And so that legislation, the Murray-Alexander bill, has a risk pool. They call it, I think, the risk corridor, but it's a risk pool. It's a pot of money that the insurance companies can go into. And because what's happening now, since they have to pay for everybody's claims, rates went up.
Right.
So if you're on a group market, you've got like the power of your group to drive prices down. But if you're just you and me and you and all of these folks, you don't have the power of the group. And so that's why one of the reasons why prices went up.
Okay.
So some of the things in that Murray-Alexander bill, cost share reductions, these are kind of wonky terms, but
Yeah.
that would help pay for deductibles and co-pays. And now deductibles and copays are really high. So
Right.
a policy can cost you, $800. Your deductible is $7,000, and your copays are $150 every time you go see the doctor.
Yeah.
Making these insurance policies basically unaffordable.
Yeah.
And then when we had a mandate, you got penalized for having a policy. You had to buy it, and then you couldn't use it.
Right.
So these things need to be fixed, and they can all be fixed with policy. There is no reason why they can't be fixed.
Okay. Do I have time for one more question?
One more.
Okay. So someone mentioned marijuana, and I
Mhm.
just want to know your look. Do you think it'll ever be legalized here in Tennessee?
There is a big movement to at least legalize it for medicinal uses. And in fact, the Republicans have sponsored a couple of bills to that end.
Okay.
So it's, its
Baby
day may be
steps.
coming. Yeah, but it's still illegal at the federal level, and
Right.
that's a big hurdle. So
Yeah.
we've got to decriminalize that, and then, take it off of Schedule 1 so that we can study its effects.
Yeah.
I'm concerned that we're jumping to the medicinal qualities without really understanding how marijuana works with other drugs.
Right.
We don't really understand dosages. Something that I would take might be inappropriate for my mother, who's in her 80s and quite frail.
Right.
So we need to figure out a lot of these questions first before we just start handing it out.
Okay.
Okay.
Good deal. Well,
Let's swap out.
Nice to meet you.
Okay.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Savannah.
Hi, Savannah.
I just have a couple of questions, just of things like I've been hearing, and that just came into my head.
Okay.
Well, I just have a basic question. So it's probably very stressful running for
Mm-hmm.
office. What was the reason why you decided to run for office?
Well, I've been working both in immigration and then in the environment, and I've been, over all these years, 30 years, been watching the erosion of all these laws and rules that were set up to protect people. And I finally realized with the November 16 election that the cracks are now visible to everybody. We can now see these problems. And I was in a position, personally and financially, that I could take the time to run. It's not an easy thing to do, and that's why few people do it. It's very expensive and it's very time consuming. I had to quit my job. So, but I really felt like I had the skills necessary, and I felt that I was a better candidate than what the Republicans would be offering.
And so you talked about a little while about renewable energy and some cleaner options that you would like to see in Tennessee. What are some ways that you can force just environmental problems in general in Congress, to push it out?
Yeah, so you could use some legislation. There's a number of rules that are being rolled back: the Clean Water Rule, the Coal Ash Rule, and those had their problems, and there were reasons why folks were wary about them or unhappy with them. And some of them were legitimate, and some of them I think were as a result of hype. But I think we need to go back and revisit those again and say, what is the priority here? The priority is to have clean air and clean water. How are we going to get there? And who's going to take responsibility for it? And when I moved here, you couldn't see the Smokies. And because of the Clean Air Act, you can see the Smokies now most days. And so, these things have been better for our health and for our economy. We have, I want to say it's like $6 billion goes into this economy, every few years, because people want to come here to see the beauty. And so you can make money. People always say, oh, environmental regulations, they prohibit economic growth. That is not true at all. So we don't need to be afraid of regulation. And when people tell me, well, regulation is bad, I like to ask them which one.
Mm-hmm.
They can never tell me.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think it's just more of that discussion, trying to work with the other side, not trying to force things down people's throats. And a new Congress will probably help.
Let's see. Oh, I looked at your issues on your website, and I just want to know your opinions on gun violence and regulation, especially in Tennessee. People go around, they're like, yeah, I can carry a gun, Second Amendment right. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I do support the Second Amendment. I worked a lot at the state legislature with the hunting groups, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Turkey Federation, and those guys were fabulous. I mean, when people wouldn't listen to me, they would definitely listen to somebody from one of those groups. And hunters give themselves an excise tax on everything to do with hunting, and that money goes into creating open space and creating wetlands and protecting open space. So that I don't want to touch. However, I think we do need some safety regulations so that children don't get slaughtered in school, so that we can go to public spaces and feel safe. And I think, it's having better background checks, having a waiting period, having an age limit, banning bump stocks, having semi-automatic weapons that are high velocity, their availability needs to be curtailed. So there's a lot of things that we can do that don't necessarily impact your Second Amendment rights, but you should have some controls. We have controls on cars. We have controls on other things. So I think we could stand a few controls.
I have a question. How are you reaching out to voters, specifically like the younger voters in Tennessee?
Well, I should turn it over to Drew. Drew, we have a lot of young folks working on the campaign. Drew is on my executive committee. Don Black, who just graduated last year, is a field director and is running all the numbers. I think there's going to be some get out the vote work here on campus. We're going to visit high schools and get the newly 18-year-olds to register to vote. But registering is not enough. You actually have to go to the polls, and they make it a bit difficult for you here. It used to be that you could use your student ID to register here, and now you can't do that. And I don't think there's is there going to be a polling place here, Drew? Okay, good, on campus. That'll be great, so that you guys don't have to drive into town to poll, to cast your vote. And then in other ways, what really worked in the primary was we did a lot of flyers. We sent flyers to folks. We did a lot of phone banking, a lot of canvassing. If folks want to volunteer, we could always use volunteers for that. There was a couple of billboards. We did texting. We did all kinds of stuff just to reach as many people as we could.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do I have another volunteer next? Yes, I see a gesture back there. So, yeah. And by the way, we are as neutral as we can be in here. We appreciate political participation regardless of party or activity.
You should invite Tim.
You
should.
I will.
You should invite him, yeah.
Hi, I'm Courtney Cox.
Hi, Courtney.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So, since everyone seems to have taken all of my lovely questions, I'm going to start with something you mentioned earlier about being as transparent as possible. So why is transparency so important to you, especially in this day and age within politics?
Well, I think there just isn't very much trust in political leadership right now. I think, we hear people not wanting to directly answer a question. They dance around. They don't want to show their tax returns. They don't want to tell you who's funding them. They're coordinating with PACs, very likely. I mean, I think a lot of that happens, and that really dampens people's willingness to get involved in the political process or vote. And I think it really increases voter suppression when politicians behave badly. And so I think there needs to be some values placed on politicians that we have an expectation that you're going to behave these ways and that you're going to agree to these certain norms. But sometimes it takes having to go a little bit farther. So there's been a lot of talk about overturning Citizens United. Well, yes, we should get PAC money out of politics. Perhaps we should not take it as candidates. That sends the message, I think, stronger than saying, I'll work to overturn legislation, but I'll still take the PAC money over here and not, and then try to pretend I didn't do it. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important that you know everybody who's given to me and how much they've given, and that you know who supports this campaign.
And speaking of the PAC money, do you wish people not people, but candidates kind of did more like you and just turned down the PAC money and focused more on donations and contributions and stuff like that?
Oh, I asked my opponent to do that on WBIR, and he turned to me and said he will take every dime of PAC money. So some people are a little bit proud of it because, your fundraising is a big deal. People nationally look at your fundraising and they go, oh, look, she raised $1 million. She must be on fire. They look at me and I've raised $215,000 and they're like, and also around. But they don't. But that's I think putting the emphasis. They're not looking at someone as a candidate and saying she's a good candidate. They're saying, raised money, has a lot of likes on her Facebook page. Clearly, she's caught fire, and you don't really know who that person is. So we need to stop doing that, I think.
Thank you. So switching in a different direction, focusing on gun laws. You mentioned the gun show loophole. What exactly is that for someone who might not know anything about how that works?
The gun show loophole is, if you want to sell out of your trunk in the parking lot, you don't have to go through the background checks. Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to sell on eBay or on Craigslist, you don't necessarily have to go through a background. Now, if you're a licensed gun dealer, you probably, you may, if you have integrity, or you may just say, I'll take your 50 and here's the gun. So you haven't performed a background check, you don't know why this person is buying a gun. And so that's one loophole that should be closed.
Okay. And for my final question, what kind of advice would you give to someone who this is like their first time voting ever? Like, you've just been registered. Like, what would you tell like a freshman coming into college who wants to vote? Like, just a real quick little piece of advice.
Wow, that's a good one. I would say go to the Election Commission's website and see who's running. And you can put your address into some of these websites and they'll tell you who you're eligible to vote for. And they should have connections, I'm gonna go check this out when I get home. They should have connections to the websites, and then just start reading up on them. And figure out what kind of values you want. What are my values? Do these people reflect my values? And then, does this person look like they're gonna be a hard worker? They're gonna, do the kinds of things I want them to do in Congress or the state legislature or city council or whatever office they're running for. But I think it's good to do a little bit of research to find out who they are. And you know what? Call them and ask them for coffee, because I didn't realize this until I started running. I'll have coffee with anybody. Just call. And nobody calls. Nobody ever asks me. So, and I've talked to other candidates, and I'm like, nobody's banging down my door to have coffee or just talk to me on the phone for 5 minutes. So, and it's important, and they'll make time for you if you're important to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Nice to meet
All
you.
right, the gentleman in the Predator shirt, I think it's your turn.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
I'm Charlie Collier. It's nice to meet you.
Hi, Charlie. Nice to meet you too.
So you, again, speaking about gun law
Uh-huh.
and you getting rid of the gun show loopholes, how do you feel like you can go about starting to reform and reverse those regulations?
Well, in the polling, if you want to believe polling, is really positive on some common sense gun reform. And so it would take probably spending a lot of time with folks on both sides of the aisle, crafting some legislation we can all live with, and then you run that, you run it through its process to try to get bills passed. I think like I said earlier, when parties just grab control and then they just start shoving things down the other side's throat, I think that doesn't work. So that would be one way of closing the loophole that we would want to do. And I think if Congress, I'm seeing, as I look out on all of the people that are running, it's a new crowd of people running. It's not the same politicians. Lots of career politicians are losing their seats to younger people that seem to have more of a will to get work done. And so I think there is going to be some kind of a change in Congress. I mean, longtime folks are losing their primaries. And so I think there's going to be a new kind of thinking in Congress in this next round of midterms. So that would make it easier to have legislation move forward.
So speaking to this new type of people in Congress, how do you feel about your Republican opponent?
Well, I've known Tim for years. I lobbied him at the at the State House for a long time. I mean, Tim is a nice man. He's funny, but Tim is also a career politician at 25 years, and I think we need new, fresh thinking, a fresh face. He doesn't have a lot to show for his legislative career, all the years that he was in the legislature, and I just think I'm a more thoughtful, hardworking candidate.
All right, so you've talked about several different issues, but what I know you mentioned the first bill that you would
healthcare.
go about, but what do you think is most important specifically for the state of Tennessee and rural Tennessee, which you'll be representing?
It would be healthcare.
Would be healthcare.
Definitely. I mean, I was up in Claiborne County at a fish fry, and I just said, it was during the primaries, and I said, everybody just bring your stuff, doesn't matter what party, bring your stuff and we'll just politic. And a lot of people came up to me and said, so what are you going to do about health care? And it was regardless of party. So it really makes me think that this is the number one issue on everyone's mind. And so that's the first thing that I would want to work on.
So I wanted to focus on education. Some of my questions were taken, but so I saw on your website that your father has like a little bit of a background in education, and how would you say that kind of influences your views on education?
Well, my father was a junior high teacher. He taught Spanish and history at a junior high. And he liked 8th grade. Ugh, it's a hard age. And then he went on to become an administrator at a community college. And he spent the majority of his career helping folks find good college placement. And college was big in my household. My mother, both my father and my mother were the first people in their family to go to college. So college was not an option for me. I was going, and I remember having a very tough conversation with my dad in the car when I was a junior, and I didn't want to go to college. I wanted to take a couple years off, and he said to me, "You will go to college, and you will like it." And so I went to college. So education has been, my uncles, all my dad's brothers, they all but one became educators, and they didn't ask you, they'd ask you how you were, and then they'd ask you about your how you're doing in school and what are your college plans. And this is true for lots of folks that come from first-time college households, that, you know, getting to college is such an achievement that they want to make sure you have a good education so that you can go to college. So that played a big part in my life. I did go to college. My first degree was in theater, and then I went back to school and got a science degree and a business degree. So I've spent a lot of years in college, and I've really enjoyed it.
I know you said that a lot of education decisions are made on the local level, but what do you see in this area that, in terms of education, that needs improvement?
Well, I think one of the things that has always disturbed me about education is that you don't go, education should be the same no matter where you live. It should be regardless of your zip code. And that people decide where they're going to live based on the education in that community is troubling to me, because I think it shouldn't matter. That you should have a quality education, and that the school should be the safe place that you go to have time to enrich your mind. And so that is one of the big things. And there's, you know, a lot of good work being done in the district around trying to make sure that education is parity across the zip codes. But that is something I'd really like to support.
Where would you rank education in terms of things that you think need to be reformed?
Well, you know, there's been a meme going around that education is that education is failing in America, and I don't think that is entirely true. I think it needs to be bolstered. I think it needs to be supported. I'm not quite sure it needs to be reformed necessarily, although there are some things that we can do to make it a better quality education for everyone. And it ranks at number 2 or 3.
Okay.
It's environment, education, wages. Yeah.
Okay, switching gears a little bit. Just generally, how would you say the political climate around here is different from where you grew up in California?
You know, it's not that much different, and people are always shocked to hear that. That people would say to me, "Oh, didn't you have culture shock when you moved here?" And actually, Northern California is quite conservative. And so when I moved here, it reminded me a lot of my hometown growing up in the 70s. And it's really one of the reasons why I like it here so much, because you know, you can have one parent staying at home and one parent working, and the kids played in the street, and that was something that I hadn't seen in California for 20 years because it's so expensive to live there. So I'd say the political climate's, you know, maybe a little bit more red here, but when I go out into the counties, I hear the same things over and over. So when you take away some of that partisanness, people still want affordable and accessible health care. They want a good education for their kids. They want to have a job that gives them pride and that they can earn a wage that they can live on. They want to have clean water and clean air. You know, those are the things I hear when I go out, regardless of the other noise. And those are the things I've been concentrating on.
Okay, so you moved, I mean, still good.
One more.
You moved here about 14, 15 years ago?
Yeah, it'll be 15 in November.
Okay, how would you say you've integrated yourself into kind of the East Tennessee area and culture?
Well, it's, you know, it's been pointed out that I'm from California, and in some ways it's kind of like, well, you're not from here. Well, I didn't get to choose where I was born. That's one thing that's a decision I don't get to make. But it's where you end up and how you, like you said, integrate into the community that makes a real difference. And I came here and spent 14 years protecting water quality for each and every person that lives in this state. And it wasn't easy. People ask me how hard it is to run. I'm like, not as hard as running a nonprofit environmental advocacy organization in the South. That was much harder than this. So I spent a lot of time working to protect water quality. I've been on many boards here. I love this place as if I was born here. Spent a lot of time in the Smokies, on the rivers, And I just really do love it. In fact, when I came here for my interview, I loved it so much. I came here for a week, and I went hiking, and I went kayaking, and I rode the bus, and I did all kinds of stuff. I thought, I'm going to move here anyway, just because I liked it so much.
That's awesome.
Okay. Good, let's switch out. Any volunteering gestures?
Oh, you're welcome.
None whatsoever? Alyssa, hiding back there, you're up.
Are all the questions getting taken by this time?
Every single one.
That's all right. Your creativity now kicks into gear.
It's like being in the press room at the White House, you know, where they
Yep.
call on you and you're like, oh, they just answered all my questions.
But hi, I'm Melissa.
Hi,
It's
Melissa.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So I was going to ask, what sets you apart from the other candidates that are in the running? Because you said something about there are new politicians running and they have a new kind of thinking. So what would you bring in your new kind of thinking?
Well, what sets me apart from Tim, aside from some of the obvious, is that, you know, I've spent a lot of time working in the community around regulation and legislation, and I know he was a legislator, but I really feel like I've got more people skills, that I understand and want to take the time to learn the issues. I want to find out what people want in their communities to make them better, to make them more productive. And, you know, while I appreciate, you know, Mayor Burchett and all the work he's done, I just think that I'm a harder worker on those issues.
And it says you stated that people don't care about the environment if they can't get a job or can't find affordable health care. What ways do you plan to not only protect and improve Tennessee's water quality, but also make jobs more attainable and accessible jobs more attainable and healthcare more accessible?
Well, that's a really good question, because a lot of times, you know, the environmental movement is a little bit on the elite side. When people are struggling, they don't care necessarily about the environment. And so the point is to make it so that people